In a dark room in Babylon, the most dangerous man on earth could no longer speak. Around his bed stood generals who had followed him across deserts, mountains, rivers, and burning cities. They had watched him destroy the Persian Empire. They had watched kings kneel before him. They had watched him march farther than any Greek commander had ever dreamed. But now, Alexander the Great was dying at only 32 years old. And when his soldiers asked who should inherit the world he had conquered, the answer, according to later tradition, was terrifying. To the strongest. Those words would turn his empire into a battlefield. But to understand why one young king shook the ancient world, we must go back to the beginning. Before the victories, before the blood, before the legend, back to a small kingdom in northern Greece, where a boy was raised to believe that the world was not enough. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon. At the time, Macedon was not respected by many southern Greeks. Athens had its philosophers. Sparta had its warriors. Thebes had its military pride. But Macedon was often seen as rough, distant, and half-barbarian by the older Greek city-states. And yet, from this kingdom on the edge of the Greek world, a storm was about to rise. Alexander's father was King Philip II. Philip was not just a king. He was a survivor. He had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes, where he studied Greek military tactics and learned how power truly worked. When he returned to Macedon, he did not simply inherit an army. He rebuilt one. He transformed Macedonian soldiers into one of the most disciplined fighting machines in history. His infantry carried the sarissa, a long pike that could reach farther than the spears of their enemies. His cavalry became fast, aggressive, and devastating. His commanders learned to move like pieces on a board. And at the center of this machine was Philip himself. One eye damaged in battle, body scarred by war, mind sharpened by ambition. Philip wanted to unite Greece under Macedonian power. But his dream did not end there. Across the Aegean Sea stood the greatest empire of the age. Persia, vast, rich, ancient, a world of royal roads, golden palaces, powerful satraps, and kings who claimed authority over nations from Egypt to Central Asia. To Philip, Persia was the ultimate prize. But before he could cross into Asia, his own son would inherit the dream. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a princess from Epirus. She was intelligent, fierce, religious, and deeply influential in Alexander's life. Ancient sources describe her as powerful and intense, though some accounts were written by men who disliked strong women at court. What seems clear is this. Olympias raised Alexander to believe he was not ordinary. She connected him to heroic bloodlines. She encouraged the idea that greatness was his birthright. And in the ancient world, where myth and politics often walked together, this mattered. Alexander grew up hearing stories of Achilles, the warrior of the Iliad, the hero who chose glory over a long life. Achilles became more than a character to Alexander. He became a mirror, a warning, and perhaps a destiny. But Alexander was not raised only on myth. He was trained for command. He learned to ride, hunt, fight, speak, argue, and lead. One famous story tells of a wild horse named Bucephalus. No one could control him. The horse kicked, reared, and frightened experienced handlers. Philip considered him useless. But young Alexander noticed something others missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. Alexander turned Bucephalus toward the sun, calmed him, and mounted him. When the boy rode the horse successfully, Philip is said to have declared that Macedon was too small for him. Whether every detail of the story is true or polished by legend, it captured what people later believed about Alexander. He saw what others missed. He moved before others understood. And he wanted more than anyone thought possible. When Alexander was a teenager, Philip hired one of the greatest minds in the Greek world to educate him, Aristotle. For several years, Alexander studied philosophy, politics, medicine, science, ethics, and literature. He learned how Greeks viewed the world. He studied Homer. He absorbed the idea that knowledge and power could serve the same dream. But the classroom did not make Alexander gentle. It gave his ambition language. It gave his conquest a cultural mission. Later, as he marched east, he would carry Greek ideas with him. But those ideas would travel beside spears, siege towers, and burning walls. That was the contradiction of Alexander. He could admire philosophy and destroy a city. He could spare a defeated king and order brutal punishment. He could speak of unity while demanding obedience. He was never only one thing. And that is why his story still refuses to die. By the time Alexander was 16, Philip trusted him enough to leave him as regent while he campaigned away from Macedon. A boy was placed in charge of a kingdom, and when a local tribe rebelled, Alexander acted quickly. He crushed the revolt and founded a settlement. It was an early sign of a pattern that would define his life. Speed, force, control. Then came the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Philip faced a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. Alexander was only 18, but he commanded part of the Macedonian cavalry. On that battlefield, the old Greek world broke. The famous sacred band of Thebes, one of the most respected fighting units in Greece, was destroyed. Macedon became the dominant power in Greece. Philip had done what seemed impossible. He had brought the Greek city-states under his control, but triumph did not bring peace to the royal family. Philip took another wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman. This marriage created a dangerous political problem. If Cleopatra produced a fully Macedonian heir, Alexander's position could weaken. At a wedding feast, an insult was reportedly made against Alexander's legitimacy. Alexander exploded. Philip rose in anger, drew his sword, and tried to move toward his son. But he stumbled. Alexander mocked him with a line remembered by ancient writers. The man who wanted to cross from Europe into Asia could not even cross from one couch to another. Father and son were now divided by ambition, pride, and suspicion. Soon after, in 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated at Aegi during a public ceremony. The killer was Pausanias, one of Philip's bodyguards. The motives remained debated. Some ancient rumors pointed toward palace intrigue. Others pointed toward personal revenge. What matters is what happened next. Philip fell. Alexander rose. At only 20 years old, Alexander became king of Macedon. Many enemies saw opportunity. The young king looked vulnerable. Greek cities began to question Macedonian control. Tribes to the north threatened rebellion. Rivals inside the kingdom had to be removed. Alexander's throne was not secure. It had to be taken, and he took it with terrifying speed. He moved north and campaigned against tribes beyond Macedon. He crossed difficult terrain. He attacked before enemies expected him. Then, when a rumor spread that Alexander had died, the city of Thebes revolted. Thebes believed Macedon was weak. Thebes believed freedom was possible. Thebes was wrong. Alexander marched south with astonishing speed. He appeared before the city almost like a ghost returned from death. Thebes resisted. Alexander destroyed it. Thousands were killed. Many more were enslaved. Only certain sacred sites and the house of the poet Pindar were reportedly spared. This was not just punishment. It was a message. Athens understood. Sparta watched. Greece fell silent. Alexander had secured his rear. Now he could turn toward the dream his father had left unfinished. Persia. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He brought around 30 to 40,000 soldiers, depending on ancient estimates. It was a powerful army, but compared to the Persian Empire, it was small. He was invading a giant. With a blade. Before marching deeper into Asia, Alexander visited Troy. There, tradition says, he honored Achilles. He ran at the tomb of the hero. He offered sacrifice. He connected his campaign to the oldest Greek memory of war against Asia. But this was not poetry. This was conquest. And Persia was waiting. The first major clash came at the Granicus River. Persian satraps gathered cavalry on the opposite bank. The river crossing was dangerous. Many commanders might have waited. Alexander attacked. He led from the front, as he would do again and again. This was part of his power. Soldiers followed him because he shared danger. But it was also part of his recklessness. At Granicus, Alexander nearly died. Ancient accounts say Persian nobles closed around him in combat. One struck him. Another prepared a killing blow. But Clitus the Black, a Macedonian officer, cut down the attacker and saved Alexander's life. 1 second later, history might have ended differently. But Alexander survived. The Persians were defeated. Asia Minor began to open. City after city faced a choice: resist and risk destruction, or submit and survive. Alexander presented himself not only as a conqueror, but as a liberator of Greek cities under Persian rule. It was politics wrapped in idealism. And it worked. But the campaign was still young. At Gordium, Alexander encountered the famous Gordian knot. According to legend, whoever untied the knot would rule Asia. The knot was impossibly tangled. Alexander either cut it with his sword or removed the pin that held it together, depending on the version. The meaning was clear. Alexander did not wait for destiny. He forced it open. Meanwhile, the Persian king, Darius III, could no longer ignore the Macedonian invader. Darius was not a weak man, despite later stories written by his enemies. He ruled an enormous empire. He had resources Alexander could only dream of: gold, men, territory, tradition. But empires can be slow. Alexander was fast. In 333 BCE, the two kings met at the Battle of Issus. The battlefield was narrow, which limited the advantage of Persian numbers. Alexander saw the moment. He led a cavalry charge toward Darius. The fighting was brutal. Dust filled the air. Shields cracked. Spears broke. Men screamed under horses. Then Darius fled. His army collapsed behind him. The Persian king escaped, but his family was captured. His mother, his wife, his children. In the ancient world, this could have become a scene of humiliation and horror. But Alexander treated them with respect. This was not simply kindness. It was strategy. By honoring the royal family, Alexander showed he could behave like a king of Asia, not merely a foreign raider. Darius offered terms: wealth, territory, marriage alliance, peace. Alexander refused. Some of his older commanders may have seen the offer as generous. But Alexander was no longer fighting for a border. He was fighting for everything. Before he could push into the Persian heartland, Alexander had to control the eastern Mediterranean coast. Persian naval power depended on bases in Phoenicia and nearby regions. If he left them behind him, his supply lines and Greece itself could be threatened. Most cities surrendered. Tyre did not. Tyre was a wealthy island city, protected by the sea and strong walls. Its people believed Alexander could not reach them. For 7 months, the siege dragged on. Alexander built a causeway from the mainland toward the island. Tyrians attacked it. Macedonians rebuilt it. Siege towers rose. Ships clashed. The sea became a battlefield. Finally, Alexander broke through. The city fell. The punishment was severe. Many defenders were killed. Many survivors were enslaved. Tyre became a warning carved into stone and blood. Gaza resisted next. Gaza also fell after a hard siege. Now the road to Egypt was open. In Egypt, Alexander was welcomed by many as a liberator from Persian rule. He respected Egyptian religious traditions. He was crowned as pharaoh, and near the Nile Delta, he founded a city that would become one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world: Alexandria. It would later house a famous library. It would connect Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Mediterranean cultures. It would outlive him by centuries. This was one of Alexander's most lasting weapons. Not the sword, the city. A city could hold soldiers. It could control trade. It could spread language. It could turn conquest into memory. But Egypt also gave Alexander something more dangerous than power. It gave him divine confirmation. He traveled across the desert to the oracle at Siwa Oasis. The details are uncertain, but ancient tradition says the oracle greeted him in a way that suggested he was the son of Zeus Ammon. Whether Alexander believed this fully, used it politically, or both, the effect was powerful. He was no longer only the son of Philip. He could present himself as touched by the divine. To his supporters, this made him greater. To some Macedonians, it made him strange. The boy from Pella was changing, and some of his closest companions were beginning to notice. In 331 BCE, Alexander marched back east. Darius had gathered another army. Larger, better prepared. The battlefield was chosen carefully near Gaugamela, in present-day northern Iraq. Darius even had the ground leveled for his chariots. He wanted space. He wanted numbers to decide the war. On the night before the battle, Alexander's general Parmenion reportedly advised a night attack. Alexander refused. He wanted victory in daylight. He wanted the world to see. At dawn, the armies faced each other. The Persian line stretched wide. Chariots waited. Cavalry massed. The fate of empires stood in silence before the first charge. Alexander moved with calculation. He angled his forces. He drew Persian cavalry away. He created a gap. Then he struck. With the companion cavalry, Alexander drove toward the center. aiming again for Darius himself. The Persian line wavered. Darius fled. The battle was lost. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, one of the greatest empires in history, was broken. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered its wealth. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, fell into Alexander's hands. The treasures were enormous. Gold and silver beyond imagination. Symbols of generations of imperial power. Alexander had achieved what no Greek commander before him had done. He had conquered Persia's royal capitals. But at Persepolis, the story darkened. The palace was burned. Ancient sources give different explanations. Some say it was revenge for Persian destruction in Greece generations earlier. Some say it happened during a drunken celebration. Some see it as a symbolic end to the old empire. Whatever the cause, flames rose over Persepolis. The message traveled across Asia. The old king of kings was finished. But Darius was still alive. And Alexander could not fully claim the empire while the Persian king remained free. So he chased him. Across harsh landscapes. Through exhaustion. Through distance. But Alexander did not catch Darius alive. Darius was betrayed by his own men, including Bessus, a satrap who hoped to seize power. When Alexander found Darius, he was dying or already dead, depending on the account. The Persian king had been murdered by those who should have protected him. Alexander honored his body and sent it for royal burial. This too was strategy. Alexander was no longer presenting himself as the destroyer of Persia. He was presenting himself as the rightful successor, the avenger of Darius, the new king of Asia. But becoming king of Asia was not the same as controlling Asia. The empire stretched far beyond the palaces. To the east lay Bactria and Sogdiana, mountain lands, fortresses, fierce resistance, warriors who knew the land better than any Macedonian. Here, Alexander faced a different war. Not one great battle, not one clear enemy, but ambushes, raids, revolts, and endless pursuit. The farther he marched, the more his army changed. Macedonian soldiers had left home years earlier. They had crossed into Asia to punish Persia and win glory. But Persia had fallen. Darius was dead. The royal cities were captured. And still Alexander demanded more. The men began to wonder, where does conquest end? Alexander founded cities. He placed garrisons. He recruited local troops. He began wearing elements of Persian dress. He adopted some Persian court customs. To Alexander, this may have looked like empire building. To many Macedonians, it looked like betrayal. They had conquered Persia. Now their king seemed to be becoming Persian. The tension inside the army grew. One of the most dangerous moments involved Philotas, son of Parmenion. Philotas was accused in connection with a conspiracy against Alexander. He was executed. Then Parmenion, one of Philip's old generals and one of Alexander's most experienced commanders, was killed as well. Whether Alexander believed Parmenion was guilty or simply feared him as a threat, the result was clear. The old guard was being removed. Alexander's rule was becoming more absolute. And the closer he came to divinity, the more dangerous disagreement became. Then came one of the most tragic episodes of his life. Clitus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander at Granicus, attended a banquet. There was drinking. There was argument. Clitus criticized Alexander. He defended the achievements of Philip and the older Macedonians. He mocked Alexander's growing Persian style. The king's anger rose. Words became insults. Insults became fury. Alexander seized a weapon and killed Clitus. The man who had once saved his life died by his hand. Afterward, Alexander reportedly collapsed in grief. But grief could not undo the murder. Something had changed. Alexander was still brilliant, still charismatic, still victorious. But his own companions had seen the danger of standing too close to the sun. In Sogdiana, Alexander captured a mountain fortress believed by some to be impossible to take. There, he encountered Roxana, daughter of a local nobleman. He married her. The marriage may have involved attraction, politics, or both. It helped connect Alexander to the local elite. But it also signaled again that his empire would not be purely Macedonian. He was creating something mixed. Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Asian, military and cultural. To some, it was visionary. To others, it was unbearable. Alexander also attempted to introduce proskynesis, a Persian-style court ritual involving acts of respect before the king. For Persians, this could be part of royal etiquette. For Greeks and Macedonians, bowing in such a way suggested worship, and they did not worship mortal kings. Resistance followed. The philosopher and historian Callisthenes opposed the practice. Later, after another conspiracy involving royal pages, Callisthenes was arrested and died in captivity or was executed, depending on the source. Again, the message was unmistakable. Alexander's world had grown larger, but the space for dissent had grown smaller. And still, he looked east. Beyond the mountains lay India. To the Greeks, India was not simply another land. It was almost the edge of imagination. A place of great rivers, elephants, powerful kings, strange stories, and enormous distance. Alexander believed the ocean was near. He believed the world could be reached, measured, and mastered. So in 327 BCE, he began the Indian campaign. The army crossed the Hindu Kush. They moved through difficult terrain. They fought local rulers. They faced fortresses and harsh resistance. Every mile was earned. Then came the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE. On the far bank waited King Porus. Porus had elephants. To Macedonian horses, elephants were terrifying. They smelled strange. They screamed. They towered above men. They could break formations and crush soldiers underfoot. The river itself was swollen by monsoon rains. Porus watched the crossings carefully. Alexander needed deception. Night after night, he moved troops and made noise along the river, confusing Porus about where the Real crossing would happen. Then, during a storm, Alexander crossed upstream with a selected force. The battle that followed was one of his hardest. The elephants caused chaos. Men fought in mud and rain. Porus stood his ground with courage. But Alexander won. When Porus was captured, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus answered, according to tradition, like a king. Alexander respected the answer. He restored Porus to power and even expanded his territory. This was one of Alexander's great talents. He knew when mercy could serve empire better than destruction. But victory at Hydaspes did not feel like the victories of youth. Bucephalus, his beloved horse, died around this period, either from wounds or old age. Alexander founded a city in his honor. For years, Bucephalus had carried him through battle. Now even the horse of legend was gone, and the men were exhausted. They had marched for years. They had crossed from Europe into Asia. They had fought Persians, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Bactrians, Sogdians, and Indian kingdoms. They had seen friends die. They had seen homes become memories. And still Alexander wanted to go farther. At the Hyphasis River, his army refused. This was the moment no enemy king had achieved. Alexander had broken armies. He had shattered cities. He had chased Darius across the empire. But he could not defeat the exhaustion of his own soldiers. He withdrew to his tent. He tried silence. He waited for them to change their minds. They did not. Finally, Alexander agreed to turn back. It was not a defeat in battle, but it was a defeat of will. For the first time, the world said no. The return journey was not simple. Alexander built a fleet and sailed down the Industry. Along the way, he fought more campaigns. At one city of the Malians, Alexander was wounded severely. He had entered the city ahead of many troops and became isolated. An arrow pierced his chest or lung area, according to ancient accounts. His men thought he might die. When he survived, he showed himself to the army to calm them. But the pattern was clear. Alexander's courage inspired his soldiers. It also terrified them, because their king did not know how to stand back. Then came the Gedrosian Desert, one of the most devastating marches of the entire campaign. Heat, thirst, sand, hunger, lost supplies, men and animals dying along the route. Ancient sources describe suffering on a massive scale. Why Alexander chose this route is debated. Some believe he wanted to surpass earlier legendary figures. Some believe he misjudged the difficulty. Some point to logistical problems and the desire to coordinate with his fleet. Whatever the reason, the cost was terrible. The army that emerged was not the same army that had entered. Glory had become survival. When Alexander returned to the heart of the empire, he found disorder. Some governors had abused power. Some had acted as if he would never return. Alexander punished many of them. He also pushed harder to integrate Macedonians and Persians. At Susa, he arranged mass marriages between his officers and Persian noblewomen. Alexander himself married Statira, daughter of Darius III, in addition to his marriage to Roxana. The message was political and symbolic. The conquerors and the conquered would become one ruling class. But many Macedonians did not want this future. They had not marched across the world to share power. They wanted rewards. They wanted honor. They wanted home. At Opis, tension exploded. Alexander announced plans that seemed to favor Persian troops and retire some Macedonian veterans. The soldiers mutinied. Alexander reacted with fury. He executed some ringleaders. Then he addressed the army with brutal emotional force. He reminded them of what Philip had done for Macedon. He reminded them of what he himself had given them: wealth, glory, empire. Then he withdrew and surrounded himself with Persians. The Macedonians panicked. They begged for reconciliation. Alexander accepted. A great banquet followed, meant to symbolize unity between peoples. But unity declared by a king is not the same as unity felt by men. Beneath the ceremony, the empire remained fragile. Then Alexander suffered a personal blow that shook him deeply. Hephaestion died. Hephaestion was Alexander's closest companion, perhaps his dearest friend, and one of the most important people in his life. They had grown up together. They had campaigned together. Some ancient writers compared Alexander and Hephaestion to Achilles and Patroclus. When Hephaestion died, Alexander's grief was extreme. He ordered mourning across the empire. He planned a massive funeral. He sought heroic honors for him. The conqueror of the world could not conquer loss. And after Hephaestion, something in Alexander seemed darker. He continued planning. He planned campaigns into Arabia. Some sources suggest he imagined more distant ventures as well, though the details are uncertain. He ordered ships built. He studied coastlines. He thought in maps. Most men would have stopped after conquering Persia. Alexander planned the next horizon. In 323 BCE, he was in Babylon. Babylon was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Massive walls, temples, palaces, a symbol of imperial power older than Macedon, older than Alexander's dreams. There, while preparing for future campaigns, Alexander became ill. Ancient accounts describe fever. His condition worsened over several days. He lost strength. He could no longer speak clearly. His soldiers were allowed to pass by him, one by one. Imagine that scene. Men who had followed him from Macedon to India. Men who had seen him charge into enemy lines. Men who had believed he was almost more than human. Now they walked past a silent king on a bed. No battlefield. No final speech. No last great charge. Just the slow victory of death. Alexander died in June 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. The cause remains uncertain. Possibilities include disease, infection, complications from wounds, or other natural causes. Poison has been suggested in ancient and modern speculation, but there is no secure proof. The truth is that the man who survived spears, arrows, rivers, mountains, deserts, and assassins may have been defeated by illness. And then came the most dangerous question in the world. Who would rule? Alexander had a half-brother, Philip III Aridaeus, who was considered mentally limited by ancient sources. Roxana was pregnant with Alexander's child, who would become Alexander IV if male. But babies cannot command armies, and generals do not easily kneel to uncertainty. According to later tradition, when Alexander was asked who should receive his empire, he answered, "To the strongest." Whether he truly said those words is debated, but they perfectly describe what happened. His generals, known as the Didakai, the successors, fought for control. The empire was carved apart. Ptolemy took Egypt. Seleucus took much of the east. Antigonus, Lysimachus, Cassander, and others struggled for power. Alexander's family was gradually destroyed in the violence that followed. His mother Olympias died. His wife Roxana and his son Alexander IV were eventually killed. The bloodline of the conqueror did not secure the empire. It became a threat to those who wanted pieces of it. This is the tragedy at the center of Alexander's story. He could win the world, but he could not build a system strong enough to survive him. His empire died almost as soon as he did. And yet, his legacy did not die. It changed shape. Across the lands he conquered, Greek language and culture spread widely. Cities became bridges between peoples. Greek art mixed with Egyptian, Persian, and Central Asian traditions. Trade routes expanded. New kingdoms rose. Scholars, merchants, soldiers, and ideas moved across a connected world. This was the Hellenistic Age, a world born from conquest, but sustained by exchange. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom turned Alexandria into a center of learning. The Library of Alexandria became a symbol of knowledge, even though its history and destruction are more complex than legend suggests. In the East, Greek-influenced kingdoms reached into Central Asia and parts of India. Art from later Greco-Bactrian and Indo-Greek worlds would blend Greek forms with local traditions. The world after Alexander was not simply Greek. It was mixed, restless, connected, unstable. He had not created peace. He had created motion. And motion is one of history's most powerful forces. But how should Alexander be remembered? As a genius? A butcher? A visionary? A destroyer? The answer depends on where you stand. To his soldiers, he was the king who shared danger and gave them unimaginable wealth. To many Greeks, he was the man who punished Persia and carried Greek culture across the world. To conquered cities, he could be terror itself. Thebes knew that. Tyre knew that. Gaza knew that. To Egyptians, he could appear as a liberator. To Persians, he was both destroyer of the old dynasty and adopter of royal tradition. To later rulers, he became a model of conquest. Roman generals admired him. Julius Caesar reportedly wept when comparing his own achievements to Alexander's at a young age, though the story comes through later tradition. Pompey called himself the Great. Emperors chased his shadow. Napoleon studied him. Kings borrowed his image. But none could fully become him, because Alexander's greatness was tied to youth, speed, risk, the feeling that the impossible might surrender if attacked quickly enough. He lived like a man racing death, and death caught him before time could make him ordinary. That is part of the legend. He did not grow old. He did not sit for decades on a throne. He did not slowly decline in front of the world. He vanished at the height of his power. This made him perfect material for myth. The unfinished life invites imagination. What if he had lived? Would he have conquered Arabia? Would he have marched west? Would he have attacked Carthage? Would he have challenged Rome before Rome was ready? Would his empire have stabilized? Or would rebellion, distance, and exhaustion have broken it anyway? We cannot know. History gives us the ending, but not the alternate road. What we do know is this. Alexander changed the scale of ambition. Before him, Greek city-states fought for territory, honor, trade, and survival. Philip made Macedon master of Greece. Alexander made Macedon master of Persia. Then he tried to make himself master of the known world. But the deeper truth is that the world mastered him too. Persia changed him. Egypt changed him. Central Asia changed him. India changed him. The farther he marched, the less he remained only Macedonian. His empire did not simply spread Greek culture. It forced cultures into contact, sometimes violently, sometimes creatively, always permanently. That is why Alexander's story is not only the story of battles. Battles explain how he won. They do not explain why he still matters. He matters because he turned geography into destiny. He took lands that had looked separate in Greek imagination and tied them together with roads, cities, garrisons, marriages, coinage, and language. He failed to keep the empire united, but he succeeded in making the ancient world smaller. Ideas traveled farther because of him. Armies marched in his footsteps. Rulers claimed his inheritance. Cultures collided and blended. And for centuries, his name remained a measure of impossible ambition. But ambition has a price. The young king who wanted to reach the edge of the world left behind widows, ruined cities, exhausted soldiers, and a fractured empire. His brilliance cannot erase the suffering. His courage cannot erase the cruelty. His vision cannot erase the blood. History remembers the glory, but it must also remember the cost. Alexander was not a simple hero. He was not a simple villain. He was a force, a man of extraordinary talent and terrifying will. A student of Aristotle who burned palaces. A lover of Homer who created real tragedies. A king who dreamed of unity, but ruled through conquest. A commander who inspired devotion, but demanded endless sacrifice. A man who reached the edge of the known world and discovered that the hardest kingdom to conquer was human limit. In the end, Alexander's life asks a question that still follows every empire. How much of the world can one person take before the world takes something back? In Babylon, the answer finally came. The strongest king alive became silent. His generals leaned closer. His soldiers waited outside. His empire held its breath. And then the man who had never lost a battle lost everything that every mortal must lose. His body failed. His voice disappeared. His empire cracked. But his name remained. Not because he conquered forever. No one does. But because for one brief, violent, astonishing moment, Alexander made the world believe that a man could outrun the limits of the earth. He could not. And that is why his story is still powerful. Not only because he reached so far, but because even Alexander the Great had to stop. History remembers the conqueror. But beneath the legend was a young man chasing Achilles, chasing destiny, chasing a horizon that moved every time he reached it. And by the time he understood the cost, it was already too late. The world he conquered did not belong to him for long, but the age he opened would echo for centuries. Alexander's empire died. Alexander's legend did not. And sometimes, in history, legend is the final kingdom.